We're at the final lecture today, so I just want to give a brief synopsis of where we've been earlier in the week. In the first lecture, I gave a survey of general intellectual history about the emotions, the passions as they're often called, and I also gave an account of Darwin, who was the first person to provide a kind of a modern evolutionary account, an account of the emotions as part of nature. And I also looked at the emotion of disgust, which has a kind of simple biological origin, but then of course gets elaborated through the development of human cultures. And on Tuesday I looked at the psychoanalytic approach to shame, concentrating in particular on the work of Erik Erikson. On Wednesday, I was talking about the work of anthropologists and historians, looking at the honor and shame culture of the Mediterranean and of Africa. Yesterday, I was looking at the sociology and history of more advanced societies, and looking in particular at nationalism and xenophobia, with a few final words about populism. So that's where we've been. Now, in today's lecture, I'm moving in another direction and focusing on another kind of emotion, the emotion of guilt. And we've already had some remarks about guilt earlier in these lectures, saying that shame and guilt often alternate, and there's a grey area where it's difficult to distinguish one from the other. And I also mentioned the fact that in the 1930s and during World War II, there was a major discussion among mainly American anthropologists about shame cultures versus guilt cultures, which the most important participant was probably Ruth Benedict, with her book on the chrysanthemum and the sword, a study of Japanese culture, which she saw as being very much a shame culture and rather different to Western guilt cultures. And this was part of her kind of war effort in World War II, and it was made use of notably by the psychological warfare department during the war against Japan. They dropped leaflets on Japan which had to be very carefully phrased. If the phrasing was "I surrender," that would be dishonorable and no Japanese would surrender. So instead the pamphlets said, "I cease resistance." So these are some of the aspects of guilt culture which we've already touched upon. But the thing is this, that we have kind of some rather wonderful work done mainly by Catholic historians on the rise of guilt culture in the West. But just let's have a look at this first slide, which is from an organization which does cultural testing and shows the percentage in the responses from their respondents of guilt versus shame versus fear. They distinguish between the kind of majority cultures in the USA and Europe, so that's what the bracket means, Anglos. The non-Anglos are the minorities, such as Native Americans in North America, Asian Australians, etc., and Roma or Gypsies in Europe. So you'll see that the blue part of the spectrum is overwhelming in the USA and in Europe, but the red steadily creeps up when we look at the Latin countries and the Asian countries and the African countries, and also in Islam. So shame is more important in those cultures other than the culture of Western Europe and North America. And we've got to somehow explain this. You'll remember the other day when I was looking at the evolution of attitudes as reflected in the Bible, we had some indication, a fairly small one admittedly, that there had been a movement in ancient times from guilt towards shame. Christianity started off as a religion where shame was more important than guilt. So, assuming that that is right, and remember it was a very tiny difference, very difficult to see on the graph which I showed, but assuming that is right, we've got to somehow explain this kind of long-term trend in Christianity towards a guilt culture. And it's very fortunate that we've had 2 or 3 really gifted historians working on this, and it's their work I'm going to mainly report on. But before I do that, I would just like to sort of add a personal anecdote. I hope people don't mind my kind of occasionally recounting personal anecdotes. There's some sense, I don't want to project the idea of my being a self-obsessed person, but I also do want to say that some of what I talk about is based on field work. I go out and visit the monuments and the historical places which I talk about. So I'm wanting to just say a word about a wonderful church which I visited last year outside Basel, a little town called Alzheim. The history there is very fascinating because the Reformation was a kind of violent in Basel, and the Protestants seized the cathedral and drove out the resident bishop and canons, who went into exile, first in France and then later on in Switzerland itself, and their exile lasted for 180 years. And of course this raises sort of interesting questions about how it was that this happened, but part of the point was that a lot of these benefices were financed by endowments and by rent on various properties, which wasn't touched in the Reformation. So the Catholic bishop continued to draw his revenues, and it was important to have a successor. And just the financial basis of the establishment ensured that there was a Catholic hierarchy for Basel 180 years later. And at that stage, they reached a settlement which allowed a new cathedral to be built at Alzheim. So we have this rather splendid Baroque building, which you see in the slide, and I visited it last year, partly because of being interested in the history of the Reformation, and also being fascinated by the sort of changes in European Catholicism, and much to my surprise, was astonished to find that the old wooden confessional was still there, but it had been converted into a children's plaything. and there was a rather lovely kind of poster up on the wall which said, "Jesus loved children." So I asked my Catholic friends, what is the situation as regards confession in Arlesheim? And received the astonishing answer that it has almost disappeared. Congregants who are troubled by moral questions nowadays make an appointment with the priest and go and see him and discuss it over tea. So we have an absolutely extraordinary kind of historical trajectory here in terms of the rise of a guilt culture inside Catholicism in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and in the Baroque period, but its relative decline recently. And so this is the kind of problem we've got to explain. And fortunately, there's a wonderful, wonderful book by a great French historian, Jean Delumeau, called Sin and Fear, in English translation, which is, the subtitle there tells you it, what it's about, The Emergence of a Western Guilt Culture, 13th to 18th Centuries. He stops in the 18th century, and there's a continuation by another great Catholic historian, which I will tell you about in a moment. But I just want to say a little bit about Jean Delumeau. I've never actually met him. I've met one or two people who were his disciples. He's been a specialist in the history of Catholicism, starting his work in the 1950s in a very sort of fashionable way. In those days, economic history and quantitative history was sort of coming in big. So he looked at the finances of the church, and in particular, the papal monopoly on the sale of alum, which was the major source of the Vatican's finances for more than 3 centuries. The mines at Tolfa were a papal monopoly, and the Pope had to either manage them himself or kind of delegate authority over the mines at Tolfa to agents. And Jean Delumeau's first book is called The Alum of Rome. And is all about the papal alum monopoly. But he gradually gets interested in kind of other aspects of Catholic history, in the history of the organization, the history of attitudes and cultures in Catholicism, and he's written a long series of books, of which I think this is probably the most notable, Sin and Fear. It's part of a 2-volume kind of diptych, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. I think it was intended to be a 3-volume work, but the 3rd volume never appeared. The first volume is called simply it's called simply Fear in the West. And is a history of various kinds of panic and moral panic, starting in the Dark Ages. And it's not just about Catholicism, fear in the West, but it obviously looks at the rise of things like the fear of lepers, which was a major sort of issue in the 11th and 12th centuries, and the fear of witches later on, and so it's an extraordinary work. And this work, Sin and Fear, is a companion volume. Because the basic story which Jean Delumeau wants to tell is that the rise of the Western guilt culture was initially driven by fear. And in some of those periods, such as the calamitous 14th century, there were many objective reasons for being afraid. The 14th century is the period when the Black Death is stalking around Europe, when you have the Turks, the Ottoman Turks moving on the borders of Europe, when you have kind of confrontations with pirates in the Mediterranean. It's a period which has actually attracted a history called the calamitous 14th century. So fear was important in the late Middle Ages and is part of the first book in the series, but it became connected to guilt through Christian theodicy. That question about why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? And the answer invariably was either because they weren't really so good, there was hidden sin, or because God wanted to test their faith. And because the idea of testing the faith also was a kind of challenging idea, an awful lot of people felt that if the times were bad, this could only be because there were sinners in our midst, or, of course, that we ourselves had offended in some way. So this is a very important part of the reasoning why fear inspired feelings of guilt. And this is perhaps the bottom line, and some of his examples are absolutely extraordinary. I'll read you a little bit from the introduction in a moment, but I just want to mention some other kind of features of his explanation. The invention of purgatory in the 11th century, which started with certain visions of Irish monks about the other world. And there's a wonderful book by another French historian, Georges Duby, called The Birth of Purgatory, showing how the church initially was a bit suspicious of these kind of visions. It's always been the response of the church, where it doesn't like it when people have visions, especially if they're lay people or especially if they are in orders but not at the top of the hierarchy. So the church gradually absorbed this, and the teaching particularly was absorbed during the Lateran councils, which were held at the Church of San Giovanni Laterano in Rome in the 11th and 12th century, and in the 13th, I think, also. And it was these Lateran councils which decided a whole lot of doctrinal matters, and once the Lateran Council of 1215 had decided that usury was not a mortal sin, but was the kind of venial sin which could be purged by the deceased serving out a term in purgatory, then it became possible for various people in the cities of Western Europe to lend money at interest. And it's no coincidence that very shortly after the Lateran Council of 1215, the first European banks were founded. Rather extraordinary to the modern cynical mind. One might have imagined that, kind of people would have been ready to engage in banking even when this was the kind of regarded as usury. And one might have, and a cynical modern person might well imagine that there would be, a kind of special charge for the risk of hellfire. But In fact, there was no banking until after 1215, and we start to see a complex revival in the European economy, particularly the cities of Italy, in that early period. Now, of course, this question about the role of the priests is one which has always been pursued by Protestants and unbelievers. There's a long, long tradition of anti-clericalism. Actually, there's also Catholic anti-clericalism, but one's less conscious of it. And it's long been a kind of staple of anti-Catholic propaganda that priestcraft consists largely of finding ingenious ways to get the laity to pour money into the church. And there's something to this. It's not a case of unfounded allegations. But it's complex, and it goes through a complex history. It's complex because, of course, the church did have important social functions in terms of feeding the poor, rescuing orphans, providing dowries for young ladies who were not going to be dowered by their families, and various other kind of charitable activities. But it certainly was the case that a number of major leaders in the church were motivated by the desire to kind of increase their finance. And the classic example of this is the first Jubilee, which was proclaimed for the year 1200, whereby any members of the faithful who made a pilgrimage to Rome in that year and made a cash contribution when they got to Rome would be relieved of years of suffering in purgatory as a consequence. And we know all about this because there's a wonderful description by the poet Dante, who was one of the people who went on that first Jubilee, and he was deeply shocked when he got to Rome and found an altar on which the money was being deposited, and two priests standing at either end of the altar, each armed with a rake in order to rake in the shekels. And of course Dante is one of the most bitter critics of the papacy. It's wonderful pieces of writing, although of course he also famously criticized Celestine, the Pope who abdicated for kind of abandoning his responsibilities. He in fact felt so strongly against Celestine that he refuses to name him. And he is merely one who made the grand refusal. Il gran rifiuto. Made the grand refusal and thereby condemned large numbers of people to rule by an unjust and mercenary and murderous pope. So we know all about the first Jubilee. The other thing which people have been less conscious about, and certainly I was very struck by reading this in Delumeau's book, is the missionary efforts on the part of various kind of orders, religious orders. We know about the Franciscans in particular being concerned to convert the Moors, and St. Francis himself making a trip to North Africa. But it wasn't only the mendicant orders. There are are a whole series of attempts by the religious orders to go on mission, and not only in the borderlands of Europe, but also in the heartland of Europe. There was a sort of general conviction that the peasantry up in the mountains were pagans, and so it was necessary for good priests who had a capacity for reaching out to the public to go there and make appropriate sermons and induce an appropriate sense of the urgency of conversion, that outside the church there was no safety. So this was a major contribution to the spread of the fear which preceded the Western guilt culture. But missionary activities also, however, raised new problems, the problems of the over-converted believer, if I can put it that way, the person who becomes so overly scrupulous that ordinary life becomes virtually impossible. So we start finding in the confessors' handbooks in this period this new disease known as scrupulosity. Delumeau's account, however, is very even-handed. It's not just the, as I said, the old sort of anti-clerical account of how the priesthood manipulated the masses. He makes it absolutely clear that the demand for masses grew faster than the supply. Basically, as the cities developed, as commerce revived, so people became increasingly concerned about the maintenance of peace, about what would happen to their relatives when they were traveling in distant parts of Europe, and these increased fears and concerns led to a huge demand for masses for the dead, for prayers, and for intercession with the saints. And he also shows that the fear and guilt complex goes right the way through to early Protestantism, and in fact is not one of the things which is altered by the Protestants. In fact, if anything, the Protestants sometimes make things more intense, because the revival of interest in St. Augustine's doctrine of predestination, only a few would be saved, meant that many Protestants were very concerned with their own salvation. So, an extraordinary story. Just let me read you a little bit of the first chapter to give you the flavour. It might easily be thought that any civilization, in this case Western civilization from the 14th to the 17th centuries, which was besieged or believed itself to be besieged by a multitude of enemies, Turks, idolaters, Jews, heretics, witches, and so on, would have not have had time for much introspection. This might have been quite logical, but exactly the opposite happened. In European history, the siege mentality, which I have analyzed in a previous book, was accompanied by an oppressive feeling of guilt, an unprecedented movement towards introspection and the development of a new moral conscience. The 14th century witnessed the truth of what might be called a scruple sickness, a global phenomenon that soon reached epidemic proportions. It was as if the aggressivity directed against the enemies of Christendom had not entirely spent itself in incessant religious warfare, despite constantly renewed battles and an endless variety of opponents. Some of it spirit was turned inwards. A global anxiety, broken up into labelled fears, discovered a new foe in each of the inhabitants of the besieged city, and a new fear, the fear of one's own self. Expressing the feelings of the entire teaching body of the Church, on the 14th Sunday after Pentecost, Lefebvre d'Etaples, who's the person who translated the Bible into French, commented in the Epistle to the Galatians, on the Epistle to the Galatians in these words: "All things considered, the life of a Christian in this world is nothing less than a continuous battle. His greatest adversary, however, is none other than himself. There's nothing more difficult for him to overcome than his own flesh and his own will, which are by nature inclined to all sorts of evil." In the same spirit, the Orthodox Catholic Bourdaloue wrote, "It is no paradox, but rather certain truth, when we say that our most fearful enemy is our own self. How is this possible? I am more dangerous to my own self than the rest of the world, for it is up to me and me alone whether or not I condemn my soul to death and exclude it from the kingdom of God." Both Lefebvre d'Etaples and Bourdaloue pushed a similar to a similar extreme their interpretation of St. Paul, according to whom a Christian must free himself from the evil instincts in order to rise above his baser nature and move heavenwards. So again, this Platonic vision which is absorbed into Christianity. And he goes on. There's the most extraordinary thing is the quote on the next page from St. Catherine of Genoa. And these are absolutely astonishing remarks. "What is man by himself without grace? A being more evil than the demon. For the demon is a spirit without a body, while a man without grace is but a demon clothed with a body. I then thought that were God ever to withdraw his grace from me, I would be capable of all the crimes committed by the demon. I therefore judged myself to be even worse than Satan himself, and much more hateful. I see myself as a devil incarnate, and all this seemed to me to be true, that if all the heavenly angels had come to tell me that I had even one good thing in me, I would not have believed them. For I clearly perceived that all that is good resides in God alone, whereas in myself resides only evil." And thus we have the reasoning of a saintly widow who devoted herself to the poor and who was subject to, and who constantly engaged in other good works and was subject to visions. She so despised herself that she even avoided pronouncing her own name. A theatrical attitude? No, this judgment would be too heavy, too hasty. We find that the same attitude is to be found also in males, also in leaders of the society. Absolutely astonishing. Now, there are, however, further historical developments from as we move towards modern times. The Catholic guilt complex, as I said, this initial feeling of intense guilt was shared by Catholics and Protestants, but it took different institutional forms in Catholicism as a result of the Catholic reform, often known, I think not altogether accurately or fairly, as the Counter-Reformation. What happened was that after the challenge of Luther, the Emperor Charles V who felt very guilty that Catholicism had been effectively challenged in his territories, was determined to try and reform the church. Reform had been constantly blocked for over 100 years because the Vatican had been really frightened of losing power to a council, as it had in the late Middle Ages. So the emperor was determined that there should be a council, and eventually a council was convened at the little town of Trento in North Italy, which was sort of neutral territory. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and so nominally under the emperor's control, but it was also in Italy and therefore under the Pope's control. And the Council of Trent, shown in this famous painting, which I went and saw 2 years ago when I went to Trent, and I saw the original church, and it's astonishing seeing the church and comparing it with the painting, because the actual church is incredibly tiny, and they've enlarged the appearance of the church for the sake of propaganda in making the painting, kind of suggesting that it was a much bigger assembly than actually assembled there at the first meeting of the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent, as I said, was forcibly summoned by the emperor, reluctantly acceded to by the Pope, but was absolutely crucial in terms of re-establishing the doctrine and morale of the Catholic Church, and did so by laying down a huge number of ordinances about bishops needing to reside in their sees, about stamping out corruption in the sale of offices, all these sorts of things. And it also decided doctrinal questions. In general, the Protestants got short shrift. So what the emperor had hoped, that there would be a reunion and a reconciliation of the churches, did not happen. But instead, the Catholic reformers, the people who stayed in the Catholic Church but wanted to stamp out various kinds of abuses, got their way. And in particular, the new instrument of the confession box was endorsed. It had come in the 16th century, and its motivation is rather interesting, but I will come to that in a moment. The most ardent supporter of the use of the confession box was the Archbishop of Milan, Carlo Borromeo, who was the Pope's nephew. This is the Medici Pope, so he was distantly related to the Medici family of Florence, but he was the reforming Archbishop of Milan, an extraordinary character, incredibly powerful and assertive. He was a fanatic. There's no two ways about it. In fact, he's the person whom Lord Acton condemned in the famous phrase about power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton had been reading Carlo Borromeo's letters and had found a letter ordering a murder. Carlo Borromeo was an absolute fanatic, and he was determined to see that the confessional was spread everywhere throughout Europe. He organized teams of priests with mobile confessionals to stand by in case of warfare breaking out, because it was important for there to be a final confession when people were dying on the battlefield. He, at one stage, was concerned about the problem of men having inappropriate sexual fantasies during church. So there was a brief period when he was trying to organize kind of following, I guess, precedents in the Jewish and Muslim worlds, kind of separate worship for men and women. At one stage, he was even advocating separate churches for women. So he was a fanatic, but he was the person. But on the other hand, there were a few good things he did too. One must give him credit. He was very keen on women's education. He took the view that women had souls and had a right to higher education just like men. As a consequence of which, Milan became the first city in Europe in which a majority of the adult women were educated. An absolutely extraordinary character, but a classic counter-Reformation saint. Now, let's have a look at the great book on the confessional. This is a book by another Catholic historian, John Cornwell, an Englishman. It's called The Dark Box, A Secret History of Confession. It's an extraordinary book. Again, John Corwin was an interesting man, struggling with various kinds of moral conflicts which arose out of his Catholic upbringing. He's the author of a book called Hitler's Pope, which is an indictment of the Vatican during the Nazi period. He's written also about more recent kind of moral problems in the Catholic Church. And again, it's an extraordinary story. The papacy, well, perhaps one should just say that confession goes right the way back in the Church. The historians of late antiquity, like Peter Brown and Elaine Padgels, all talk about confession in the early Church. But confession in the early Church was usually a public event. People stood up and gave a testimony. And so it was very different from confession later on, because in the early church, confession was very often more profession than confession, people kind of affirming their beliefs and talking about their dreams and their encounters with angels and with saints. It goes right the way back in that form, but it took a different form in the Middle Ages. The papacy first made annual one-on-one confession obligatory in the early 13th century. In the centuries that followed, confession was a source of spiritual consolation as well as various other things, such as sexual and mercenary scandals. And of course, you must understand that if one has this intense guilt culture, confession is one way of relieving guilt. Of course, it can also work the other way around. It can serve as a source of promoting guilt. If people have not been to confession, if they're afraid to go to confession, those sorts of issues. But already in the early modern period, there were worries about the charge for confession, because confession was not free in that period, and about the scandals when you had male priests groping women and similar sorts of things. And these were the kind of abuses which, of course, the Council of Trent was directed to stamping out. During the 16th century, the Church introduced the confessional box to prevent sexual solicitation of women. But the private space gave rise to new sources of power and temptation. Thus, an extraordinary kind of institution was promulgated throughout the Catholic world. And then in modern times, there was a major change. Confession and indeed attendance at Mass was expected to be kind of an annual event, usually at Easter. This was the kind of minimal requirement. You could go beyond that, and many people did go beyond that. But going to confession before going to Mass and going to Mass at Easter was the kind of minimal requirement for several hundred years. And of course, we know that there were tremendous controversies about this. It was one of the issues between the Catholics and the Jansenists. The Jansenists condemning the Catholics for too frequent attendance at the Mass. The Jansenists, who in some ways were spiritual snobs, kind of were always careful to kind of limit their indulgence because they said they took the Mass much more seriously than other people. Anyway, the main change, however, happened in relatively modern times. A profoundly abusive consequence followed a historic decree of Pope Pius X in 1910. Pius sought to protect the Catholic faithful by lowering the age at which children made their first confession from early teens to 7. At the same time, he exhorted all Catholics to confess weekly instead of annually. In the decades that followed, the Catholic clergy's unprecedented access to children led to the widespread psychological oppression to which many Catholics could witness, and in an unfortunate significant number of cases, to child sexual abuse. A direct consequence of the idea of making children aged 7 confess to a male priest once a week. And of course, that also goes, I think, far to explain the recent collapse of the practice. Obviously, we've had all the sex scandals in recent years, towards the end of the 20th century, and it's been worldwide. But, of course, it's not the only thing which has upset Catholicism. The big changes introduced by Vatican II were also kind of very important in terms of creating diversity of Catholic practice around the world. So a full history of the decline of the Catholic guilt culture has still to be written, but John Cornwall has done a wonderful job on the history of the confessional. Okay, now that's as much as I want to say about the guilt culture. I wanted to end with a final discussion of kind of some issues which have been peripheral to these lectures so far, but I think are ultimately very important, although unresolved, questions about what is the proper moral response to the havoc sometimes unleashed by the negative emotions. And here, I think it helps to realize that in antiquity, the philosophers didn't just advocate kind of manly self-control, which was the kind of normal Greek attitude to the emotions. There were important groups of philosophers, who sought to control the emotions, and The most important were the Stoics. Stoicism started as a philosophical movement in Athens. A lot of these movements, of course, took their name from where they were located. The academy was a grove of trees, but the Stoa was a porch overlooking the marketplace. And that was where the first Stoic philosophers gathered. Now, Socrates, of course, was a hero to many people for many different things, and his kind of courage and fortitude facing his end were kind of legendary, and that was the kind of aim which the Stoics aimed at. One should achieve this state of a kind of non-engagement, of confidence and relaxation by controlling one's emotions. Stoicism spread from Greece to Rome. It was particularly taken up by slaves. Epictetus was a slave, and there were a number of other Roman philosophers who were adherents of Stoicism, who were from the lower classes or were slaves or freedmen. Stoicism, to some extent, was a competitor with Christianity for adherents of the upper classes in ancient Rome. One thinks of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, very much in the Stoic mould. Stoicism, however, was not the only philosophy which had adherents and was in competition with religion. There's also Epicureanism, which actually I think is older than Stoicism, if I'm not mistaken. And Epicurus advocated the life of pleasure, but instead of interpreting that in a kind of voluptuous modern terms, he was actually advocating mild pleasures, like sitting in the garden in the shade, and kind of the an enjoyment of kind of frugal meals and that sort of thing. So Epicureanism, which again spread throughout the Middle East, we know there were Epicureans in Palestine because the rabbis condemned them, and Epicurus is an unbeliever. These were the two main antique philosophies which were concerned with the control of the emotions. Well, in the Renaissance, as I keep saying, it wasn't just the revival of classical antiquity, it was also the critique of classical antiquity. So you had a neo-Stoic movement. The most famous representative of the neo-Stoic movement was the classicist Justus Lipsius, who was a professor at one of the Dutch universities, I've now forgotten which, but he was a remarkable man and sort of very well balanced between Catholicism and Protestantism. Both the Catholics and the Protestants were vying for his support. There he is, presiding over a group of friends, which include Rubens and his brother. This is a painting by Rubens. Lipsius was the person who advocated the revival of Stoicism in the Renaissance, and it gets taken up by a number of other people, and of course interacts with some of the other important cultural traditions of the time. And extraordinarily, it has been revived in recent years. The most important recent attempt to curb the emotions is that of the neo-Stoic movement, founded by the philosopher William B. Irwin. There he is on the left. This is William B. Irwin. He's still with us. On the right is his book called A Slap in the Face. Why insults hurt and why they shouldn't. Irvin is the pioneer of what is called insult pacifism. Pacifism is responding to aggression with non-aggression. Insult pacifism is responding to insults by not returning the insult. Because returning the insult just perpetuates the harm or the danger of harm. And he has developed a whole series of techniques in terms of things like making self-deprecating remarks or making witty remarks or taking an insult as an intellectual challenge, whereby you can rise above the shame engendered by insult and achieve a higher state of being. Remarkable man, remarkable doctrine. I think I have been practicing insult pacifism without knowing it for part of my adult life, but it's wonderful to have this now kind of written up and given in the form of practical advice. So there he is, and of course once we've started talking about insult pacifism, it's irresistible to go on and talk about the older and more profound thing, pacifism itself, the moral challenge presented by pacifism. And of course, we have great moral teachers in this debate on both sides. There on the left is Gandhi, this wonderful quote, "An eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind." And Gandhi was the person who, of course, urged his followers to develop extraordinary self-control because in the pursuit of social justice, he knew that they would constantly be reviled and exposed to insult and even possibly more, injury. And he thought that the crucial thing was for them to see this as a challenge and respond non-violently. So Gandhi is one of our great moral teachers in the 20th century, but there are good arguments on the other side as well. I've got another one of my heroes on the other side, George Orwell. In the 1930s, where he was utterly opposed to the pacifism which was going to appease Hitler, saying, "Pacifism is objectively pro-fascist, and this is elementary common sense." Now, it seems to me that I'm somewhere in the middle on this debate. That is, I think that the use of non-violence is wonderful, but not always possible. It would not have worked against Hitler. And so I'm ready to side with Orwell in terms of endorsing non-appeasement and, in fact, fighting in the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War. But it seems to me that as a technique of social change, there's a tremendous amount to be said for non-violence. Martin Luther King is another one of my heroes. And the great argument here is precisely the question that if one defeats an opponent without convincing him, then you haven't really achieved a proper and lasting victory. He who's convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So the argument here is that there are kind of moral ways of resisting oppression, and there are immoral ways of resisting oppression, and it's important to draw the line. And it's important also to be ready to make considerable sacrifices and to exercise self-control when one is trying to stand up for justice. tremendously important lessons, I think. So, to sum up, the negative emotions are still with us. They're part of our biological heritage. But human culture has, over the course of time, found various ways of ameliorating the situation. Through the teaching of the great religions, through the development of law, litigation rather than fighting, and through non-violence. These seem to me all important things to bear in mind. And perhaps there's more. Perhaps because we realize that the emotions have an important cognitive component, we should be thinking about cognitive therapy. So that is the kind of thing I want to end on, because of course we live in interesting times and face the challenge provided by populism and prejudice daily. Thank you. With a few final words about populism. So that's where we've been. Now, in today's lecture, I'm moving in another direction and focusing on another kind of emotion, the emotion of guilt. And we've already had some remarks about guilt earlier in these lectures, saying that shame and guilt often alternate, and there's a grey area where it's difficult to distinguish one from the other. And I also mentioned the fact that in the 1930s and during World War II, there was a major discussion among mainly American anthropologists about shame cultures versus guilt cultures, which the most important participant was probably Ruth Benedict with her book on the chrysanthemum and the sword, a study of Japanese culture, which she saw as being very much a shame culture and rather different to Western guilt cultures. And this was part of her kind of war effort in World War II, and it was made use of notably by the psychological warfare department during the war against Japan. They dropped leaflets on Japan which had to be very carefully phrased. If the phrasing was "I surrender," that would be dishonorable and no Japanese would surrender. So instead the pamphlets said, "I cease resistance." So these are some of the aspects of guilt culture which we've already touched upon. But the thing is this, that we have kind of some rather wonderful work done mainly by Catholic historians on the rise of guilt culture in the West. But just let's have a look at this first slide, which is from an organization which does cultural testing and shows the percentage in the responses from their respondents of guilt versus shame versus fear. They distinguish between the kind of majority cultures in the USA and Europe, so that's what the bracket means, Anglos. The non-Anglos are the minorities, such as Native in Christianity, towards a guilt culture. And it's very fortunate that we've had 2 or 3 really gifted historians working working on this, and it's their work I'm going to mainly report on. But before I do that, I would just like to sort of add a personal anecdote. I hope people don't mind my kind of occasionally recounting personal anecdotes. There's some sense, I don't want to project the idea of my being a self-obsessed person, but I also do want to say that some of what I talk about is based on field work. I go out and visit the monuments and the historical places which I talk about. So I'm wanting to just say a word about a wonderful church which I visited last year outside Basel, a little town called Alsheim. The history there is very fascinating because the Reformation was a kind of violent in Basel, and the Protestants seized the cathedral and drove out the resident bishop and canons, who went into exile, first in France and then later on in Switzerland itself, and their exile lasted for 180 years. And of course, this raises sort of interesting questions about how it was that this happened. But part of the point was that a lot of these Americans in North America, Asian, Australians, etc., and Roma or Gypsies in Europe. So you'll see that the blue part of the spectrum is overwhelming in the USA and in Europe, but the red steadily creeps up when we look at the Latin countries and the Asian countries and the African countries, and also in Islam. So shame is more important in those cultures other than the culture of Western Europe and North America. And we've got to somehow explain this. You'll remember the other day when I was looking at the evolution of attitudes as reflected in the Bible, we had some indication, a fairly small one admittedly, that there had been a movement in ancient times from guilt towards shame. Christianity started off as a religion where shame was more important than guilt. So, assuming that that is right, and remember it was a very tiny difference, very difficult to see on the graph which I showed, but assuming that is right, we've got to somehow explain this kind of long-term trend. We're at the final lecture today, so I just want to give a brief synopsis of where we've been earlier in the week. In the first lecture, I gave a survey of general intellectual history about the emotions, the passions as they are often called, and I also gave an account of Darwin, who was the first person to provide a kind of a modern evolutionary account, an account of the emotions as part of nature. And I also looked at the emotion of disgust, which has a kind of simple biological origin, but then of course gets elaborated through the development of human cultures. And on Tuesday I looked at the psychoanalytic approach to shame, concentrating in particular on the work of Erik Erikson. On Wednesday, I was talking about the work of anthropologists and historians, looking at the honor and shame culture of the Mediterranean and of Africa. And yesterday, I was looking at the sociology and history of more advanced societies, and looking in particular at nationalism and xenophobia.